There's humor in the story, and the humor is sometimes lost on us in the English translation. The same way that there was great terror in the previous week's story that's lost on us in the translation. This week there's surprise, there's humor. It's almost like someone's waiting to make a rom-com of this, but we'll show that as we get there. So, Genesis 24. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become wealthy. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male and female slaves, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and he has given him all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I live, but you shall go to my father's house and to my kindred and get a wife for my son. Just stay on that slide. Who's he talking to? What's happening here? Well, in Genesis 22, we have the sacrifice of Abraham that we had last week. In Genesis 23, Sarah passes away at the ripe old age of 127. And she is buried, and the Bible tells us Isaac was deeply distressed about his mother's passing. And he's also unmarried, and he's getting to about 40 years of age, which is unusual in his time to be unmarried at that age. And Abraham is getting very old, and Abraham is seeing this whole promise that God has made, that from his son Isaac, this great multitude of nations will spring. It's kind of hanging in the balance because Abraham is getting very old, Sarah's no longer around, and Isaac just can't seem to find a wife. And so he says to his servant, don't let my son marry one of these Canaanite women. Go back to my father's house and find someone from our kin. And so he goes. And so we have this story. He finds a girl. We'll read about her in a second. And then he sits down with her father and her uncle to negotiate her marriage. Okay? My master made me swear. This is interesting in the text, and this is why we started with this as well. When Abraham calls his servant, right in the beginning of this chapter, to give him this great mission to accomplish, he says to him, quite euphemistically in our Bible translations, put your hand under my hip, and then swear that you will accomplish this task. We think, well, that sounds very strange. Why would you put your hand under someone's hip? But the Bible translation actually says, put your hands on my loins, which is also quite euphemistic. But I want you to swear by my seed and by my promise and by the promise the Lord has made. This is how serious this is for me. Don't put your hand on my heart. Put your hand where it matters. Because this promise is important for God, for you, and for me. This shows up later in the story as well, when Joseph is in Egypt and Jacob is an old man. He makes Joseph swear by putting his hand under his hip, as well, as it were, to make a promise that he will take care of his brothers. So this is a serious thing. This is a promise and a solemn oath made under the most serious of circumstances. And this slave takes it very seriously, and that's why he goes. And he goes to this land. Next slide. And I came to a spring. Oh, and he had 10 camels. That's important in the story as well. And he said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you will only make successful the way I am going, I am standing here by the spring of water. Let the young woman who comes out to draw, to whom I shall say, please give me a little water from your jar to drink, and who will say to me, drink, and I will water your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. So you all remember that great movie from the 80s, The Karate Kid. Yes, and there's Mr. Miyagi, and he is he's living in America, but he's from Okinawa. He knows karate, and he saves Daniel-san's life one night from a bunch of thugs. And then Daniel-san says, "I want to learn karate. I want to know what you know." And so Mr. Miyagi says, "Great, come around tomorrow." And he says, "Well, here's the cloth, here's the wax on, wax off. There you go." And Mr. Miyagi, of course, has about 10 cars. And Daniel-san spends the whole day waxing and waxing, and his arm is growing very, very tired, but he doesn't do any karate. And when he's done, he goes back to Mr. Miyagi and he says, "Here you go, I've done this all. Now can we start training? I'm ready to do some kicks and punches." Mr. Miyagi says, yeah, come back tomorrow. He gets there the next day, and he's got a bucket of varnish, and he's got the brush, and he says, "Okay, now do the fences, up, down." And so Daniel's son is painting the fences the whole day, but he doesn't do a lick of karate. And when he's done, his arm is aching. He says, "Okay, well, I've done all that. Now I'm ready to learn that really cool stuff." Mr. Miyagi says, yeah, come back tomorrow. And then it's actually a very old practice in places like Okinawa and Japan. If you went to a martial arts master's house and said, "I want to learn your martial art," he'd say, "Yeah, cool. Take all those rocks in the back of the garden and carry them over to that side. And then you can start learning karate." And so he would take everything to that side, and then the disciple would come back and say, "Okay, I've carried all the rocks, can we start?" And then the master would say, yeah, carry them back all the way and put them back. And we think, well, that's a little bit silly. But the master is watching for something in the student's character. He's watching to see, are you grumbling while you're carrying the rocks? Are you growing tired? Are you only doing half the job? Or is your character trustworthy? Because if you want to learn what I know, you need to be of good character. And so they would do this for months and months. They would do these chores. But the master is looking very intently. And the slave here is doing something similar. He's saying to the Lord, "Lord, I'm going to give the woman who offers me a drink a test. If she offers of her own to water my camels, I'll know that she is someone who is generous, who is hospitable, who is kind, and who is caring, and she might be a good wife. And if she doesn't offer, then I know to find someone else." So there's a bit of a test here. This is why I said there's humor and there's surprise in the story that kind of gets past us if we don't pay attention to it. Next slide. And before I had finished speaking in my heart, before I had finished praying, there was Rebekah coming out with her water jar on her shoulder. Now, how many liters of water can you put on a jar on your shoulder? 20? A little bit more if you're strong? And she's coming down to the spring to get water, and she drew, and I said to her, "Please give me a drink." And she quickly let down her jar, and she said to me, "Drink, and I will water also your camels." So I drank, and she also watered the camels. Now, 10 camels. A camel drinks between 60 and 90 liters of water at a time. She has one jar, which she has to go to the spring with, fill up, carry to the trough, and empty into the trough. Now, my math isn't very good, so I became a minister, but you can imagine the amount of work that she was doing, not just the physical strength and stamina, but the mental resolve and the character that it takes to do that, and not to skimp on how much water you're giving, and not to say, "Oh, these camels look okay with, half the water." She is going through a lot of effort, and it must have taken a lot of time to water 10 camels. This is important in the story because while this is happening, the slave is watching her very closely. Typical man, he's sitting under the tree. Watching her. Is she grumbling? Is she finding an easy way out? Is she going to come back after a few camels and say, "Oh, actually, I've got to, get back"? No. She waters all 10 his camels, and then he knows she might be the one. So I said to her, verse 47, "Whose daughter are you?" And she said, "The daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. And so he knew, yes, this is someone from Abraham's side of the family. Great. So I put a ring on her nose and bracelets on her arms. And I brought her back to her father's house. And here I am negotiating for her hand in Isaac's marriage. Next one. Then I bowed my head and I worshipped the Lord, and I blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me by the right way to obtain the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Now then, if you will deal loyally and truly with my master, tell me. And if not, tell me, so that I may turn either to the right hand or to the left. So you find this in certain parts of the world and in African cultures today still. When two people decide to marry, they will obviously say, well, I'd like to marry you, or I'd like to engage in marriage discussions. But the actual negotiations for the marriage takes place between the uncles of the two families. They sit down and they kind of negotiate, and they say, well, our daughter is very precious to us. She's worth, 200 heads of cattle. And then the uncle from the bridegroom side of the family might say, yeah, no, she's fantastic, but we think she's worth about 150 heads of cattle. And then they say, no, come now, you can't, put a cheap on her that way, 190 heads. And so they negotiate until they find some kind of common ground, and they say, okay, well, you can have our daughter if we can have 190 heads of cattle as compensation for her going to go live with your family now instead of staying in our family. This is why when the slave, just the first slide again, Rayleigh, when the slave begins, this is one long negotiation, right? When he begins, he says, the Lord has greatly blessed my master. And these uncles' ears start pricking up. He has become wealthy. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, many male and female slaves, camels and donkeys. It's his way of saying, look, name your price. We would like Rebekah very much. In fact, when he takes her from the well, right there and then, he puts a ring in her nose and he puts bracelets on her arms as a sign to see, hey, look, she's going to be well taken care of if she lives with us. You don't have to worry about that. Okay, back where we were, Rayleigh. And so they're deliberating, and they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? Rebekah says, I will. So they went away. So they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse, along with Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes. Then Rebekah and her maids rose up, mounted the camels, and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Now Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi and was settled in the Negev. Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field, and looking up, he saw camels coming. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel and said to the servant, who is the man over there walking in the field to meet us? And the servant said, it is my master. It's Isaac. It is the one whom you are going to marry. So she took her veil and covered herself, and the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Just two quick things here. At Bible study, we asked each other that question, why does she cover herself upon meeting Isaac? And Joan told us, where's Joan? Joan told us, yeah, that was the practice for unmarried women in the Bible, to cover their faces with a veil so that others would know that she is unmarried. You only show your face to the man with whom you are wed. And so she sees Isaac, she's unmarried. Quickly, while they're riding the camels, it doesn't matter because no one's seeing them. And then she covers her face to show him that she's unmarried. But what's very interesting here is verse 64. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly. It sounds very gracious, doesn't it? You know, she's very graceful. She's just, she sees him, and then maybe she's riding side on, so her dress doesn't flare up, and she slips quickly off, and she puts her veil on. But it's interesting. And this is part of the humor in the story. The words there translated with slipped quickly. Every other time they're used in the Bible, they literally mean fall down on your face. So if this were a rom-com and we were watching this playing out on the big screen, she's riding on this camel and she sees this man walking in this field, the grain around his hands, the sun behind him, his locks flowing, just broad shoulders and tan skin. And what does she do? She falls flat off her camel in surprise. And you know what, guys? We should chuckle about that. It's there in the story. It's there for us to explore. And sometimes we're a little bit serious about the Bible, all things considered. But she falls flat off her camel, and then she gets up and covers her face. And then she goes to meet him. And then the last slide, Rayleigh. Then Isaac brought her into his mother, Sarah's tent. Sarah's passed. There'll be no more children between her and Abraham. That promise is now securely and solely with Isaac. And so Rebekah now assumes Sarah's place as the new matriarch of the promise that God has made. And he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. We don't often hear that in the Bible. We don't often hear about people who are married who share love, because people didn't marry for love. They married for arrangement, for gain, for security, for safety. But not for love. But Isaac loved her. And so Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. This is the word of the Lord. And you know what? Sometimes the best sermons are just telling the story. Sometimes we just have to lose ourselves in the story of God with people. We could make a long sermon about the slave's faithfulness and his dependence on God. He doesn't just say by himself, "Oh, I'm going to go sit by the spring and wait for the first girl who's going to offer my camels water." He says, "Lord, if you are with me in this endeavor, then bless this plan I'm about to put in place." So we could say, yes, there's a real dependence here on God. Or we could go the other way and say, pay close attention to how God is involved in everyday things. In offering people water, in acts of generosity and kindness. Pay close attention to where God inserts himself into the story. Because we could tell the story without God there as well, and it looked quite the same. But the slave of Abraham reminds us God is behind this. Why? Because God made a promise to Isaac and a promise to Abraham that will be fulfilled. This is why the slave swears by the loins of Abraham, because this promise is not to be taken lightly. Interestingly, the word we know as testify has something to do with swearing by the loins, but I'll leave that to your imaginations. Because this promise is not to be taken lightly.